This is a podcast from BFM89.9, the business station.
Open for Business on BFM 89.9.
Good morning and welcome to Open for Business, the show that dives into the journeys and ventures of entrepreneurs and business leaders. This is Audrey Raj. Let me describe a problem that sounds simple but isn't. You want to do business with a company. You want to know who you're actually dealing with, not the company name, the person, the real owner, the one at the end of the chain, behind the holding companies, behind the nominees, behind the complex structures that modern corporations are built with. And apparently, in this part of the world, that question can take months to answer. Now, Daryl Neo knows that problem very well. He spent years as a regulator at the Singapore Exchange, manually tracing exactly these kinds of connections. And in 2011, he and his co-founder left the SGX to build a tool they always wished they'd had. Handshakes is now the largest aggregator of ASEAN and China private market data. It's a platform that visually maps corporate relationships, ownership chains, and hidden connections. And the coolest part about the whole thing, Handshakes is now being used to uncover the networks behind stock market crashes, cross-border investment scams, and conflict of interest cases across Southeast Asia. Daryl's got all the details for us, and he's here in the studio with me today. Daryl, welcome to Open for Business.
Thank you for having me.
Daryl, I want to start with what a hidden corporate relationship actually looks like. How do people structure companies to kind of hide or to obscure who's really in control, and maybe also tell us a bit about the patterns that you were seeing when you were a regulator?
Wow, there's actually a spectrum. We've actually seen the structures evolve over the past 15 years. From more simple structures, you have people who are just trying maybe to dodge tax. Maybe they're trying not to register for sales service tax, for example. So then they would use layering by asking their aunties, uncles, cousins, or parents or siblings, right, to be the proxy. But essentially, it's all about using proxies. You can go all the way to the other extreme where you have very complex, almost like cross-border syndicates. And they are using multiple levels. They are daisy chaining control and ownership chains. And they would use not just relatives. Usually they don't use relatives. They would be using trusted associates, sometimes intermediaries, even professionals.
You mentioned the term daisy chaining.
Yes.
What does that mean?
So if you want to get really sophisticated, you don't just use layers of directorships or shareholdings. You alternate them. So for example, the layers may be 5 or 6 layers deep. One layer is through a directorship. Then later you hold control through shareholding above a majority. Then the next layer you hold through directorship again, and then you alternate. It makes it more difficult to detect.
Tax evasion aside, what are some of the other reasons that people would want to obscure their corporate relationships or connections?
So many. I've seen cases where it's simply businessmen wanting to prepare for a divorce.
That's interesting.
So then you don't want, your other half to be able to find all the assets. It can also go to cases where people are actively actually committing fraud. Sometimes there's collusion involved. A very common case is when governments put out procurement tenders. They usually need to have 3, 5, sometimes 8 offerors. And it's not uncommon that 3 or 4 offerors are actually linked behind to the same person.
It's the same person, right?
Yes,
right.
Correct. So those would be cases where you want to obfuscate the common ownership or control.
Right. So back when you were at SGX, how would you have to trace these connections? I mean, how did you have to do that manually without a platform like Handshakes?
Wow. It's quite difficult. Back then, there was no database. So it's really by chance. It depends, honestly, on the officers remembering and saying, this name sounds familiar.
Oh, gosh. Right.
Yeah. And then from there, you just like, okay, I suspect I've seen this somewhere. You look at your notes. You hope that you were also the officer involved in one of the other companies in the chain, and then you can piece it together. Right. So that was actually what it was like in what I call the Stone Age, right, last time, the Dark Ages.
So detection levels, I can imagine at that point would have been quite minimal.
Yes, it's by luck. There was even a funny trend last time where sometimes companies would change the name of their company, the first letter, because they know that some of these banks or regulators, they actually sort the portfolio by alphabetical order. And you know that I want a particular officer, or I want to keep moving between officers.
Right, quick fix. So, in your opinion, Daryl, and in your years of experience, why is a platform like Handshakes so important to how we run business today?
I can answer that in two parts. You could call it supply and demand or offense and defense. The bigger problem I'm trying to solve is actually on the defense side, meaning on the side where the regulators, the compliance officers are. To be very honest, it's actually very difficult to run a compliance team today. The first issue is that to groom an experienced, capable compliance officer or regulator, it requires a lot of case experience. It's not the number of years that you've done the job. And very often when someone gets quite competent, they usually join other companies. You leave, right? And when you talk to most of the experienced compliance officers, that's a challenge that they face. So one way to help is to increase the productivity. If the officer spends so much time collecting data manually, they cannot do so many cases. It takes more years to become competent. So that was my life when I was a compliance officer. So we were just simply trying to speed up some of the manual work so that we spend more time doing the analysis, finding those cases, getting more experience. But on the offense side, of course, you have more and more complex ways that people are trying to evade. In fact, today, layering is like just the starting point. As I told you, you can get into daisy chaining and many more things. So then we're trying to connect more data sets together, right? So that you can then try to find more parts of the daisy chain.
Right. Okay, so maybe, Daryl, you can explain the Handshakes platform to someone who has never seen it. What does a user actually see when they open it up, and how does it work?
So the Handshake platform essentially has two layers. There's a data layer. We spend a lot of effort working with data owners. Usually they are governments or sometimes partners in countries who have a license to be able to make the data from the government available to the public. So the first part of the product is essentially a simple tool that allows you to query a company and get records. The second part, which is the differentiator and also where we add value, is all these individual reports in a country, they are usually not linked. Sometimes the name have a slight spelling difference or the ID number is slightly shifted. So we would spend effort to join up those identities accurately. After you do that, they start connecting. Then you can start seeing this person actually has 5 companies. This company has 6 directors who then altogether have 30 companies. Then when you have that data matched this way, we put it into a visualizer. Because if you don't visualize as a graph, you see it as a list, it's very difficult to see the pattern.
Right.
So the Handshakes app is basically the database layer. And then when you use it, usually people interact with the graphing layer.
Right. Who are your target customers at the moment?
There's 3 groups. Because I started as a regulator, the first group has always been, we call them the gatekeepers. So regulators, compliance officers. So these could be government or they could also be financial institutions. That's the first group. The second group increasingly are the large corporates, especially those that do a lot of trading. They are effectively also giving a lot of trade credit, right? And they need to check procurement records and all that very often. So that's the second group. The third group is very new. There's a lot of new industry players doing payments, digital banks, and wallets. Yeah. So a lot of these, they are serving merchants at scale, and they need to check records on those merchants. For example, if you are a big e-commerce platform, and you have a problematic merchant, it's very common the merchant will just deregister, start something new, different name, right, and then come back. So that's the growing risk.
All right, folks, we need to take a quick break for some messages. But when we come back, the mindset shift Daryl thinks Malaysian businesses need to make and what S&P Global saw in Handshakes that made them invest. I'm speaking with Daryl Neo, CEO and co-founder of Handshakes. I'm Audrey Raj. You're listening to Open for Business. We'll be right back after these messages. BFM 89.9.
Beyond Frivolous Matters, BFM 89.9, the business station.
BFM 89.9, welcome back to Open for Business. This is Audrey Raj. And on the show today, I'm speaking with Daryl Neo, CEO and co-founder of Handshakes, the Singapore-based corporate intelligence platform. Now, before the break, Daryl, you were talking to us about how Handshakes looks like, who it's for. I want to touch a bit about some of the significant real-world investigations that Handshakes has been used in. The 2013 Singapore penny stock crash, cross-border Malaysia-Singapore investment scam, some conflict of interest cases as well. Can you use one of these possibly as an example to help us understand what it revealed that investigators couldn't see or couldn't find through conventional means?
Very often, in fact, if you look at our website, we are intentionally not talking about them for two reasons. The first is we want to respect the customers, but also sometimes you also don't want to reveal too much about how it was detected in the first place.
Don't want to give away too much.
Correct. But maybe I can share one or two. So as I said just now, layering is a very common thing. I think here in Malaysia, there's this recent term called the Alibaba structure, because there are quite a lot of policies here that would require, for example, a Bumi name, right, to be on the register. But the company might not necessarily be owned or controlled effectively by someone who qualifies.
Yeah.
So then that's where you have the Ali in front and then the Baba behind.
Understood. Okay. Now I get the term.
Right. So this is a typical example of what we can help to detect. And this is actually helping to protect taxpayers' money in most cases, because sometimes really those grants or those tax breaks are not intended for those businesses, right? But they want to, in a sense, dress it up by putting a name in between that qualifies. So then when you use Handshakes, you can actually detect it in two ways. The first is directly going up the chain. You will be able to see whether or not there's someone else behind with the control or with the ownership. But at the same time, because we see the whole graph, you can also see whether they may have actually been caught once. Then they stop trying this, they start a new arm. And then they start a new line, a new ownership line. Yeah, so this type of detection, I think right now is particularly relevant to Malaysia because the policies are unique.
Right.
Yeah. Also very common would be procurement fraud. As I said just now, you have cases where there's collusion between the offerors. But another common case is actually conflict of interest between the procurement officer or even the approving officer in the company and then the vendor, right? So in those cases, it means it's not uncommon. The approver, maybe actually the uncle or auntie may actually own the vendor that's selected. Yeah, and to be honest, it's actually not difficult to use data from SSM to detect this. It's just that you need to connect the data up, right?
Yeah.
And see maybe a few layers.
Right. I'm thinking about some of the privacy implications when trying to surface something that somebody's actually effectively trying to shield or they're trying to hide, right? This must be tricky.
Well, it's actually quite common when we meet first-time prospects, right? And then sometimes they get a shock. They're like, hey, how come this type of data, isn't it sensitive? Isn't it even private? So that's where we're very clear that we only use the data that are filed publicly by the companies. It looks like a lot now because we've stitched it together, right? Whereas in the past, you only see one company at a time. But we never, ever just go and dig and look on an individual. It's always about the companies. Yeah.
Now, Takaful Malaysia MOU, it's your most recent Malaysian milestone. The first deployment of Handshakes in Malaysia's Takaful and insurance sector. Where else is appetite for corporate intelligence tools growing here in Malaysia?
Takafu has been a great partner, and I think the biggest pain point that we are solving for the industry is a pain that was created by regulation. They have to do UBO, ultimate beneficial owner checks, within T+1 of a transaction happening. So it used to be many days, but now it's within 1 day you have to turn around.
Wow.
So if you are trying to run a business at scale, there's no way you can do manual checks, right? If not, the compliance team becomes the limit on how much business you can do each day.
Right.
So because of that, we're actually working with them on automating a lot of the checks, which is exactly what Handshakes does. So a lot of the appetite is driven by regulation, especially for financial services. I think it will also eventually be driven by the limit in terms of how big your compliance team can get. Yeah. Sometimes when I sit at dinner or lunches with financial services compliance bosses, they literally compare how big their teams are. I'm running 500 packs. I'm running 100 packs. How are you going to find so many compliance officers at some point? Yeah. So I think that also is another driver for demand. But our type of business, it's a lot of it is driven by this type of regulatory changes. Sometimes in the news, when certain large investigations break, we do see a surge of interest.
So would it be like the chief compliance officer that actually decides that an organization needs handshakes? Basically, I'm asking who in an organization actually decides this is what we need. You know, this is interesting. This is a platform. This is a solution that we need in our organization. Who are you selling to?
The journey has actually changed. So in the early days, it actually starts with most often the CEO. They get to know about us. They see big picture. They see a constraint on growth. And then they would call the compliance team and say, I want you to look at this. Most of the time, a compliance person, even if they see a product or a service available, they don't want to rock the boat because their job is to prevent things from happening, right? So in the early days, it was driven more top-down. But through the years, it has changed quite a bit because now we have a lot of friends, in the compliance teams who have been using us for years. Sometimes they move around. And then they join a new firm and they say, hey, that was this tool I use. So then we start to see the compliance layer being the first introduction.
So Daryl, your clients subscribe either action by action, I think that's the term, or they use something called an unlimited enterprise package. What type of organizations do you see going for the unlimited enterprise package? Would be the regulators and such, right?
For sure, the regulators. It's interesting. This is about business and pricing model, right? There are two drivers that would determine that. The first is usually the scale of the customer's operations. So if you are running a bank or government agency and it's practically a daily activity already for your officers to be doing this type of checks, then definitely you have scale for the enterprise license. There are smaller firms where maybe the need or the checks, they can actually cluster them into, this part of the year, then I do the checks. Then for those, it doesn't make sense to get an enterprise license. The second driver is more interesting. We didn't expect it at the beginning. It's the approval structure for procurement. So there are some organizations where they just need a fixed number for the year, right? And then you would use the enterprise license because you can say this is the fixed number for the cost for the year. Their approval process may not be so easy to clear, right? If it's a variable number, meaning I pay as I use. Yeah. So that's the second driver.
What is the difference in the price range for these packages?
It can be quite big. That's a crossover point, right? I think it depends on the country data set. So for example, I think usually if you cross into the few hundred searches every year, that's where we would recommend that you start looking at the enterprise. Don't necessarily have to wait until you hit the crossover point because human behavior, right? When you're on a pay-per-use basis, you tend to ration. And if you're not far from it and suddenly you go to enterprise, suddenly you will start to change the way that your workflow is.
Right. Now, before we came into the studio, Daryl, you described the shift that you want clients to make as moving from treating compliance as a cost to treating compliance as intelligence. Why is this important to you?
Okay, so 2 reasons. Remember I said just now that productivity is one of the first reasons I started this. So today, when you have a case that you need to check, after you finish and you onboard that customer, there would usually be a risk rating. And based on that, you have to recheck that client maybe every year or every 3 years, depending on your policy. And that is simply compliance. One of the things we try to do is to automate that to the point where there's continuous monitoring. So then that changes life for you because first, you no longer have to come back to that record every year or every 3 years. Simply wait and see when there's a change. We ping you and then you go and look. So that then becomes intelligence already. You're not just following a procedure, but you actually know when the risk change almost to the day. I think at that point, a lot of things change for the officer. First, the check is now automated, right? So it's more productivity. But the second is the risk that you have to take in the business changes. Last time, from the time the company changed shareholding or directorship, you may take 1 to 3 years to realize it. Today, you can know it almost to the day. And that will allow, I think, a lot of new business models for our customers. They don't have to take so much buffer, maybe, right, on their positions. And then that allows them to do more business for the same amount of capital.
All right, folks, it is time for us to take another break, this time for the news bulletin. But when we come back, Nikkei Inc., SPH Media and S&P Global, they all sit on Handshakes cap table. We'll talk about that and more happening on Open for Business with Daryl Neo from Handshakes. We'll be right back after the news, BFM 89.9.
Breaking financial matters. BFM 89.9.
BFM 89.9, welcome back to Open for Business. This is Audrey Raj. On the show with me today, I have Daryl Neo, CEO and co-founder of Handshakes. So we've kind of covered the product. We've covered a bit about the business. I now want to zoom out a little. But first, I want to talk about your cap table. Your investors include Nikkei Inc., SPH Media, S&P Global. S&P Global led the 2022 round, and S&P is one of the world's largest financial intelligence companies. Does having them on your cap table kind of open doors for you?
Definitely it does. First, for sure, it attracts a lot of attention. But also because of the amount of data that they have. I mean, talking about S&P Global in particular, earlier I mentioned that one of the ways we try to add value now is connecting more data sets so that you can find more layers of the onion, right? S&P Global has a wonderful business that has a lot of data on supply chain and shipping information. So, for example, ships that port at most of the major ports in the world, they have to declare what is the shipment they're carrying, who shipped it, who's receiving, right? And that information combined with directorships and shareholding, ownership and control information is actually very valuable.
Now, I also understand that you're building an AI map summarizer and you're also building in some agentic AI capabilities. What does that actually look like? What will it look like when it's done? And how will this kind of take Handshakes to the next level?
Yeah, I mean, AI is something everyone just has to say that they're doing, right? But to be honest, for us, there's a very practical reason that we're doing it. Today, when we start connecting more data sets together, or we start to have data from larger countries, like for example, China, you have almost 80 million companies, right? When you start graphing out the connections of the large companies, even the human eye cannot understand the graph. It's just too much noise. And right now, the users of Handshakes have to use their own experience to say, this is the part I want to look at, this is the part I want to filter. And it takes a lot of time. More importantly, it takes a lot of experience. By having an AI layer that can do the map layout, essentially what the AI does is it is learning from the behavior of very strong users, how they clean up the map to focus on the findings. And then from there, it is applying that to a new map And it's basically telling the officer, here's the raw, and this is what, it would look like, or it might look like if you cleaned it up. And then from there, it tries to point out to them, these are the relationship chains that are more interesting. So we're trying to do two things with this. The first is, of course, reduce the time taken. But more importantly is, if I don't need a 10-year experienced person to use the graph, if now a 3-year experienced person can use the graph, I've just managed to increase the size or the competency of the compliance teams in my customer's organization. The second reason is also we notice from the workflow, after the officers get the graph that they want and they have the findings, they usually have to type out the findings, right? Very, very typical workflow. And the typing out is essentially a summarizing task. So if I can get the first AI to work well enough for the client to say this is good, then I can add a summarizer AI. And then that would shorten their workflow. Again, it is to allow the same officer to do more cases.
So if everything goes according to plan, Daryl, say in 5 years, what does the corporate intelligence process look like? Say for a Malaysian bank's compliance team, what role does the human analyst play, the compliance officer there play in the process versus what Handshakes will do autonomously?
So I actually don't see AI or even tools like us replacing the officer. At the end of the day, the tool is there to learn from the behavior of the officer and try to multiply what they can do. In 5 years' time, I think maybe there would be 2 or 3 changes we hope that we can make happen. The first is that the AI allows more junior officers to do more complex cases. Today, most of these compliance office companies, they actually have different levels of cases, right? And usually the problem is the complex cases need to go to senior folks, and that's very hard to have enough of them. So we hope that this problem is alleviated with the technology. The second change I hope we can do is if we can add more layers of data, especially beyond company data, as I said just now, shipping data and others like that. I think that would help increase the speed, because the clients today already need that data. It's just they have to keep hopping out to new platforms to get the data and manually combining. And the last change I hope is cross-border data. I think ASEAN for sure is moving towards harmonization of the economies. We've talked about it for decades, but I think it is moving. And as that moves, there will be country pairs that more and more of our clients need to check. For example, Malaysian company will maybe doing a lot more business with Indonesian company, with Thai companies. Then the cross-border check will become the next bottleneck, which we hope we can help solve.
That was going to be my final question to you, Daryl, because I like what you said about how, there's no way for ASEAN economies to integrate if, say, a Singapore business cannot understand a Vietnamese business, right? So it really does sound that you're positioning Handshakes not just as a compliance tool, but sort of like infrastructure, critical infrastructure for regional economic integration. Is this the game plan?
Yes, it is. I think definitely it's meant to be a type of utility for what we call the gatekeepers. Of course, in 5 years, I do think the definition of a gatekeeper may also change. We're already seeing that change in many companies. Those activities may not sit purely within regulation or compliance teams. I think now with the new company structures coming up, sometimes that may even directly sit with business or operations teams who are joining the two together. So for example, if a digital bank uses this information, they don't just look at it from compliance, they're actually looking at it from lead generation also. If I can find the companies with a problematic structure for risk, it also means I can look at the other side of the coin, which are the other companies that maybe I should be doing business with. And can you give that list to me so that I can pursue those companies?
Right. Daryl, it's really been fascinating talking about Handshakes. For listeners out there who are keen to learn more about Handshakes, maybe you can give them the website they can look at.
Oh, we're at www.handshakes.ai.
All right. Daryl, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you very much, Audrey. It's a pleasure.
Folks, I've been speaking with Daryl Neo, CEO and co-founder of Handshakes, the Singapore-based corporate intelligence platform used by banks, regulators, auditors, and compliance teams across ASEAN. Once again, if you'd like to learn more about them, you can find them at handshakes.ai. And if you missed out on any part of this conversation, catch the full podcast on our website, BFM.my, or you can also find us by downloading the BFM app. My name is Audrey Raj. You've been listening to Open for Business on BFM 89.9, the business station.
You've been listening to Open for Business on BFM 89.9.
You have been listening to a podcast from BFM 89.9, the business station. For more stories of the same kind, download the BFM app.